Chapter 6 of The Victorious Attitude by Orison, Swett, Marden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Attracting the Poorhouse. As long as you hold the poorhouse thought, you are heading toward the poorhouse. A pinched, stingy thought means a pinched, stingy reply. No matter how hard one may work, if he constantly holds the poverty ideal, the poorhouse thought in his mind, he is driving away the very thing he is pursuing. The man who sows failure thoughts, poverty thoughts, can no more reap success, prosperity harvests, than a farmer can get a wheat crop from sowing thistles. Poverty is a mental disease. Someone has said that no one ever went to the poorhouse who did not attract the poorhouse by his poorhouse mental attitude. Observation and long study of the question have convinced me that, as a rule, people who make miserable failures of their lives expected to do so. They had such a horror of the poorhouse, they lived in such terror of coming to want, that they shut off the very source of their supply. They had so warped their minds that they could see nothing but poverty ahead. They wasted the precious energy which might have been utilized in happiness and prosperity building, in expecting, dreading, and preparing for the dire things that might come upon them, and, according to the law, they got what they dreaded and feared. Thinking war, talking war, anticipating it, getting ready for it. In other words, preparedness for war. The perpetual war suggestion was largely responsible for the outbreak of the greatest war in history. If all the nations involved had talked peace, thought peace, expected it, prepared for it, there would have been peace, not war. So long as people talk poverty, think poverty, expect it, get ready for it, they will have poverty. Preparedness for poverty, expecting it, attracts it, confirms poverty conditions. We are constantly drawing to ourselves that which we expect. If you are sending out a perpetual poverty thought current, a doubt current, a discouragement current, no matter how hard you may be working in the opposite direction, you will never get away from the current you set in motion. The sort of thought current you generate will flow back to you. Everywhere we see people trying hard to get on, struggling early and late to better their condition, and yet never expecting or even hoping to be prosperous. They do not believe they are going to get what they are working for, and they do not. A typical example of those who keep themselves in the poverty current is a woman I know who is constantly affirming her inability to better her condition. She answers her better-off friends who tell her that she ought to have this and that by saying, "Oh, it is all very well for you rich folks to talk this way, but these things are not for me. We have always been poor, and I suppose we always shall be. We can only have the bare necessities of life, and are fortunate if we get these. Of course, I might indulge in a little treat for myself and the children now and then, but that would be extravagant, and I must save for a rainy day." Now, I have no quarrel with people who save for a rainy day. It is the part of prudence to be prepared for all emergencies. It is a splendid thing to save for spending, for enjoyment in our later years. But people who begin early to provide for the rainy day, and who deny themselves every little pleasure and enjoyment for the sake of adding to this provision, fall into the habit of pinching themselves, and usually continue to do so through life. This woman limits her supply by her conviction that every cent she can spare must go to the rainy day fund, because she is always going to be poor. She assures herself and others that she is never going to have the things she would like to have, because of her poverty, and so she starves the lives of herself and her boy and girl in anticipation of a day of possible want. She is a type of a multitude of men and women who settle down to their poverty, become half reconciled to its limitations, and do not make a strenuous effort to get away from it. That is, they never dream of exercising their creative positive thought, but continue to live and to realize in their conditions the negative, destructive poverty thought. These are the people who are always saying they cannot afford things. They cannot afford to send the boy or girl to school or college this year. They cannot afford the necessary clothes or the needed vacation because of the rainy day, which, like a specter, rises at every feast, on every occasion when they try to get some enjoyment or satisfaction out of the present. They are always postponing things until next year, but this next year never comes, and the children never go to the academy or college, and they themselves never take the needed vacation, the travel in one's own country or the long promised trip abroad. They keep forever postponing the enjoyment of the good things of life until they can afford it, and that time never comes for people of this apprehensive habit of mind, because they always want to lay up a little more for the future. I know a number of people well along in years who are still pinching themselves not only on the comforts but even on the necessities of life in anticipation of the possible rainy day, for which they are always planning. They make life one long continuous rainy day, and little realize that they often tend to create the need for which they are perpetually saving. We sometimes read in newspapers striking illustrations of the results of this starved, rainy day habit of mind. A New York daily recently reported a typical instance, that of an aged woman who had died alone in the slums of the metropolis. She had been dead several days when her body was found, and so wretched were her surroundings, it was first supposed that she was penniless. On investigation, however, it was found that the woman had in ready cash and in bank deposits almost $10,000. Pauperized by her diseased mind, this wretched creature, like so many other poverty-stricken souls, died of starvation in the midst of plenty. Her mind was so obsessed with the poverty thought that she even denied herself the necessities of life. For years she had shut herself away from the great stream of life flowing all around her, so that she might hoard and hoard and hoard. She would allow no one to enter her rooms, and died alone and uncared for, leaving behind her the money which would have made her comfortable, happy, useful, and would have prolonged her life. She was as truly a victim of the poverty disease as though she didn't have a cent. The children of Israel, while passing through the wilderness, were constantly reflecting the poverty thought. Can God furnish us a table in the wilderness? Of course not. It is not reasonable. We shall starve if we do not get back to Egypt. But for the faith of their great leader Moses in the power that led them, they would have gone back to Egypt, back to the slavery and poverty from which they had fled. Even after the manna had been given them fresh every day for a long time, they did not believe the supply would continue. They were still skeptical and tried to store enough manna for a rainy day. But it would not keep, and they were forced to trust a new supply every day. But where is our supply coming from? How are we going to pay the rent, the mortgage off the home, the farm? Where is the money coming from? What will happen to us if we cannot get it? Where are the children's clothes coming from? How are we going to get the necessaries of life? Where is our supply coming from? Why can't I get a job that will enable us to really live? These are the questions multitudes of people all over the world are asking themselves. They express the acuteness of the suffering from the poverty disease, so apparent in every civilized country. Nothing else gives human beings so much anxiety. Nothing else is such a perpetual irritant as this fear of what is coming in the future, this dread of poverty, of not being able to provide for the necessities and the comforts of those dear to us. The fear of not being able to maintain ourselves and rear our children in comfort and respectability. It demagnetizes us, drives away the things we want and draws to us those we dread. Job said, "The thing I greatly feared has come upon me. That which I was afraid has come to me." People who have an abnormal fear of poverty attract the very condition they dread and are trying to get away from, because the mind relates with whatever it dwells on. Our doubts and hatreds and fears, the things we relate with, we attract. Whatever you allow your mind to dwell on, you are unconsciously creating. If you think continually of misfortunes, of poverty, if you fear you are going to fail in your work, that you may come to want, if you are always thinking about the possibility of your business declining, if you fear that you are losing your grip on your trade or profession, you are aggravating your trouble and making it worse and worse. There are multitudes of people who never expect even to be comfortable, to say nothing of having luxuries. They expect poverty, hard times, and do not understand that this very expectancy increases their magnetic power to attract what they do not want. Not long ago a young man who was greatly depressed because he could not get on in the world asked me what I thought the trouble was. He said he had always worked hard, but did not seem to make any headway. About all he could do was to earn a bare living. Everything appeared to go against him. Fate, he complained, seemed determined to keep him down, no matter how hard he might struggle against it, and he was doomed to be poor, to be a nobody. He believed that hard luck, poverty, and failure were family traits, for his father and grandfather, he said, were hard workers too, but they could never get on, never get away from poverty, and he didn't expect he ever would either. Another, an older man, who sought my advice in a similar difficulty, lamented the fearful inequality of human conditions, and rallied against his luck and the injustice of fate. "I work early and late, Sundays and holidays," he said, "and I haven't taken a vacation for years. I have been struggling and striving and pushing to make my way in the world since I was a boy, and here I am, past 50, and never succeeded in anything yet. Now there is something wrong somewhere in society when such persistence and such constant efforts do not enable one to get anywhere or to rise to any position worth while." I asked him about his early training and education. He acknowledged that he had not made much of a preparation for his life's work, because, he said, his father also had been a tremendous worker. He had always tried hard to better his condition, but like himself had never succeeded. And so he had come to the conclusion that success was not in the family, and that it was no use to spend years in preparing for a career, for there was no chance that very much would come to him anyway. These two types of people are constantly heading toward poverty and failure in their minds, and then complaining when they have got what they invited. By the law of mental attraction, they could not get anything but poverty and failure. Each had desired success and prosperity, but had always expected the opposite. He had slaved and toiled in an aimless sort of way, belittling himself and his talents, with the inner belief that it was all he was good for anyway, and that if success by any chance ever came his way, it would be a stroke of luck, and not because it was his due by inherent right. No man can become prosperous as long as he holds in his mind the picture of limitation, of lack and want. We do not get things in this world which we do not believe we can get. We do not accomplish what we doubt we can do, even though we have the ability to do it. I knew a boy in college who always felt certain he was going to fail in his examinations, and he did fail invariably. Yet it was due more to his fear, his terror, of failure than to lack of ability or preparation in his studies. He had formed a habit of expecting failure, of predicting misfortunes, of looking and preparing for them, and so far as I know they have followed him through life. In every community, in every occupation and profession, there are able, conscientious men and women who try very hard, so far as their actual labor is concerned, to get on in the world, but who don't expect to get on. It is pitiful to see them toiling day after day, but always facing in the wrong direction. They are working for success in their vocations, working for a competence for themselves and their families, but all the time expecting failure, anticipating poverty, living in an atmosphere of mental penury. There is no law of philosophy by which you can possibly produce just the opposite of what you are holding in your mind, what you are concentrating on. If you are thinking down, if you are afraid or worried, if you have fears and doubts, if you keep visualizing, thinking, talking hard times, panics and financial crisis, your business will shrink and shrivel accordingly. If on the other hand you have confidence, expectation of better things, if you are convinced that conditions are going to improve, you set in motion a thought current that will back your efforts with an irresistible force. But a thought current saturated with the fear of failure, with doubts and discouragement, will neutralize your most strenuous efforts. Instead of starting on their active careers with the victorious attitude, with the idea that their careers are to be a triumphal march, many, if not the majority of youths, begin with the impression that they are not victory organized. This is because they have lived in a failure atmosphere and have absorbed the poverty idea. They have been reared with the fear of failure in their minds, a dread of poverty, a terror of coming to want. Write it in your heart that a beneficent Creator, who planned a universe full of good things for our use and enjoyment, never meant that we should starve or be miserable. If we are unsuccessful, unhappy, it is because of our attitude toward God and life. Most of us assume the position of beggars instead of that of children of an all-powerful Father, and we remain beggars to the end. One of the worst things about being very poor is the danger of becoming reconciled to penury, expecting it, holding the conviction that we shall always be poor, that there is no help for it. The habit of thinking we must remain poor because we are so is a paralyzing habit. Whatever we have accustomed ourselves to for any length of time tends to become a fixed mode of life. Multitudes of people have become so accustomed to their poverty environment, so used to taking it for granted that they are going to remain poor, that they do not take the necessary steps to get away from poverty, and they do not even know that the first step must be a mental one. Instead of this, they are all the time affirming their poverty, getting more and more deeply embedded in the poverty condition by their poverty thoughts and convictions. In the early years, multitudes of children are saturated with the poverty suggestion. They breathe a poverty atmosphere. They hear poverty talk perpetually. They acquire a poverty vocabulary. Their fathers and mothers are always talking poverty, bemoaning their hard conditions, complaining that they were born poor and must die poor. Children reared in such a mental environment get a sort of poverty habit from which it is very difficult to get away. The facing toward poverty and despair, heading toward hopelessness and failure, is the worst thing about poverty. The fixity of their conviction that they cannot get away from poverty, their resignation to it, their firm belief that they can never rise into prosperity, these are the most distressing things about the very poor. There is a tremendous difference between the prospects as well as the mental attitude, and the facial expression of a poor boy on a farm who dreams of the day when he can go to college, who pictures himself there, who believes with all his heart that his dream will be realized, and the prospects, the mental attitude and face of another boy similarly situated, who also longs for an education, but has abandoned all hope of ever going to college, or ever getting away from the grinding drudgery and monotony of the farm which he hates. We must change our thought before we can change our conditions. The thought always leads in any achievement. It would be as impossible for the great mass of poor people to improve their position materially while holding their present mental attitude, the present belief that they are always going to be poor, and that they never can do what others have done to get out of their rut, as it would be for the boy who longs to go to college, but who has made up his mind that it is impossible to get a higher education. While they think that all others are lucky and they are unlucky, while they continue talking about their hard fate and thinking that the rich are getting all the good things of the world and that they are getting only the dregs and never will get anything else, why, of course, they will never get anything else. Most poor people have about the same attitude toward poverty that those who are constantly ailing have toward health. Habitual invalids never expect to be really well. They are always anticipating the development of some disease, looking for the symptoms, imagining that they are going to have this or that physical disability or disease. The way to have health is to think it, to expect it, to visualize it, to realize that health is a positive, everlasting fact, and disease only negation, the absence of health, which is brought about largely by a wrong mental attitude, by self-thought poisoning, by disobeying the laws of health. If we are going to be well, we must think vigorous, robust, cheerful, health thoughts, and we must observe the laws of health. We shall have the same degree of health that we give to our mental health model. It is our visualizing of health that brings the expected condition. It is the same with poverty. Not long ago a man told me that he would be perfectly satisfied if he could be assured that he would never have to go to the poorhouse, that he would have enough to provide the bare necessities for his little family. He said he never expected to have anything better. He was satisfied that it was not intended for him to have any luxuries. He had always been a poor man, and he always expected to be poor. Now this is just the thing that kept this man poor, for he was a hard worker. He always expected to be poor. He did not expect anything better. He merely worked for the bare necessities of life and did not expect anything else. And of course he only just managed to squeeze along, making but a bare subsistence. This attitude of the poor toward poverty tends to increase it, to aggravate their disease. So long as one holds the poverty thought, he is making himself a poverty magnet, and continually drawing to himself unfortunate conditions. We have a good illustration of this, a real object lesson, in the gray-haired men everywhere seeking a job. I have watched these desperate men on their rounds looking for work. They are poverty-stricken in appearance. Their expression is one of utter hopelessness. They look like men who are going downhill, men who have reached the period of diminishing returns, and they feel exactly as they look. Their appearance is the reflex of their thought. Their dress, their manner, their gait, the look in their eyes, everything about them corresponds to their mental attitude, and all point downgrade. If these men would only brace up, look up, dress up, before they seek a job, there would be some hope for them. If they can't get better clothes, they can brush the old ones, blacken their shoes, have a bath and shave, and above all a mental clean-up, and their chances will be 10 to 1 compared with what they were before their physical and mental clean-up. A man has got to radiate confidence in himself, the expectation of success, before he can get a job. He has got to show that he has reserve power, that there is a lot of good blood in him, working material, success possibilities, or nobody will want him. The man who goes to an employer in a discouraged attitude and begs for work on the ground that he needs it very much, who whines and complains how hard it is for anyone who shows the signs of age to get a job, is not going to get one. If you are in the clutches of a poverty so dire that it robs you even of the desire to get away from it, you are cursed with self-thought poisoning. This is what mars and embitters so many lives, drives away happiness, health, and prosperity. Poverty is usually a disease. It is just as much a disease as is smallpox or tuberculosis. It is just as abnormal to the human being as any disease of the flesh. So is failure. Fear, worry, anxiety. These are all mental diseases, from which few human beings seem to escape. But we are gradually finding an antitoxin for the virus of those diseases so fatal to efficiency, health, happiness, and prosperity. The Bible tells us the destruction of the poor is their poverty. Every investigator of slum life in our big cities, every record of the lives of the unfortunate poor in our midst proves that this is an absolute truth. Extreme poverty is a scourge that draws its victims down from depths to lower depths, that makes life a bitter struggle for the bare crumbs that hold body and soul together. When these are not forthcoming, it drives the weak, despairing struggler to crime in order to keep himself from starving. Or if he is still too proud to steal, to beg, or to go to the poorhouse, he ends his life, rather than wait for the slow, cruel process of starvation to quench it out. Every year, poverty claims its tens of thousands of innocent victims among the little children who die of disease and neglect, in damp, foul cellars where the sun never enters. It sweeps them into mills and factories, where, robbed of the rights of childhood, they become warped and twisted men and women, full of bitterness, discontent, unrest, and unsatisfied ambitions and longings. It drives multitudes to crime, to insanity, to death. In short, poverty is responsible for more ignorance and crime, more discontent and unhappiness, more suicides and ruined ambitions, more wrecked hopes and homes than almost anything else. Verily, the destruction of the poor is their poverty. If we are to progress as a race, as a civilization, we must emphatically drive this crushing poverty disease from our midst. Instead of lauding its blessings as some do, it is our duty to get away from it and to help others to do so. The poverty disease, the poverty curse, is not a decree of Providence. It is largely the result of ignorance. Every human being on this earth could be living in comfort, if they knew the powers locked up in themselves and were willing to work and make the best use of them. If the poverty antidotes were as generally known as the poison antidotes, there would be no poor people. Human beings in the aggregate are in much the same position regarding the poverty antitoxin as the medical profession in regard to newly discovered antitoxin for some terrible disease. Physicians do not know how to apply it safely and effectively, and until practice has established its great value its use is limited. When the knowledge and the use of the poverty remedy become general the disease will be conquered. As the race becomes more intelligent and better educated, we eliminate a multitude of conditions to which people formerly thought they were born, and that there was no escape from them. Many evils which have been conquered by science and education were at one time regarded as scourges sent by God to punish us for our sins, to chasten us. Diseases which struck terror into the hearts of human beings 100 years ago, and from which they fled in horror, are not feared at all today. Intelligence and science have mastered the great plagues which in the Middle and Dark Ages carried off their terrified victims by the million. We have no fear of those plagues today, because we have obliterated their causes. We know now that the prevention of those frightful epidemics is merely a matter of sanitation, scientific hygiene, intelligent, healthful living. We know that they were scourges forged by ignorance and not judgments of God. Is it not reasonable to believe that having conquered so many of the enemies of the race by intelligent thought and scientific methods, we can conquer them all by similar means? Poverty is a plague, a mental disease, which can be conquered by intelligent scientific methods. We know its causes and we can remove them. They are largely mental. It is not necessary to call in a physician to treat the poverty disease. The sufferer can be his own physician. He can heal himself. If you are afflicted with the disease and want to know how to get rid of it, read the next chapter. End of chapter 6.